On August 15, 2010, a 49-year-old Diane Kane lay dead on her bed in her bedroom. Her son, Kevin, panicked and called the emergency service, shouting to the operator that his stepfather had killed his mother. A few minutes later, another call came in to 911 from the same location. This time it was Bill Kane, Diane's husband. With difficulty catching his breath, Bill told the operator that his stepson had strangled his wife. There were only 3 people in the house, and one of them was dead. Only 2 know the truth. What happened to Diane Kane that day? Was she killed by the man she considered the love of her life? Or was her life taken by her own flesh and blood? The calls were all the more unusual because they were made in the midst of a heated argument. One person called and told the truth, while the second had already figured out which story would allow them to come out unscathed. It's unfathomable how cunning the mind of this killer must be. The city of Seminole is located in Pinellas County, Florida. It's where Bill Kane lived with his wife, Diane, and her 23-year-old son, Kevin. Bill describes Diane as the woman of his dreams. They met in the early 2000s when Bill noticed a very beautiful woman outside a nail salon that she managed along with her twin sister. They exchanged a few words, and Diane continued with her business, but the beautiful woman stayed on Bill's mind. He had to find a way to get to know her. Bill persuaded his daughter to get a manicure at the salon. With his daughter's support to visit the salon, he gathered the courage to ask Diane out on a date. It was a passionate romance, and less than 2 years later they were married. Bill's 5 children were happy that their father had found new love. Diane's son, Kevin, also initially formed a strong bond with Bill. After 4 years of living with his stepfather, he decided to take his family name. The family seemed very happy. However, not everything in the family went smoothly. Kevin had always been the center of his mother's attention, and now he had to move into a home with 5 other children and share their collective memories, which made him feel like an outsider. Kevin's cousin remembers that it wasn't easy for him because the other children didn't accept him and didn't treat him well. However, by 2010, all 5 of Bill's children had grown up and started their own lives. Only 23-year-old Kevin was living with his mother and stepfather. At that time, Bill owned an auto repair shop, and Diane had started a business on eBay, filling the house's bedrooms with her merchandise. The spouses felt they had fulfilled their duty in raising their children and were looking forward to enjoying life just the 2 of them. They even tried to officially evict their son from the house, but without a job, he had nowhere to go, and his mother always took him back. So all 3 of them continued to live in the same house. On August 15, 2010, it was a Sunday. In the quiet neighborhood of Seminole, Florida, the day began as usual. However, the tranquility of the Sunday didn't last long. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, shocked neighbors of the Kane family watched through their windows as Bill and Kevin literally tumbled out of the house and continued to brawl on the front lawn. In an attempt to restrain his stepson, Bill tore his clothes, but Kevin managed to snatch his cell phone from his pocket and called 911. To witnesses, it seemed like the fight lasted an eternity. But in reality, the stepfather and stepson struggled for only a few minutes. Finally, Kevin managed to break free from Bill's grip and ran to the neighbors, dressed only in his underwear. Bill returned home and also dialed 911. The police arrived at the house in a few minutes. In the house, they found Diane dead. She was lying on the bed in the bedroom face up. Medics who arrived at the scene noticed that her body was already cold, indicating that she could have been killed sometime before the calls were made to the emergency services. An autopsy later revealed that she had been strangled. Kevin told the police that he had lain down to rest on the couch because he was recovering from a recent surgery when his stepfather woke him up by slapping him directly on his scar on his head. Bill stated that his mother wanted to talk to Kevin and asked him to come upstairs to her bedroom. Kevin replied that he wasn't feeling well and would come up later. However, Bill soon returned and demanded that his stepson come upstairs immediately. Kevin complied, but as soon as he tried to open the bedroom door, Bill attacked him from behind and put him in a chokehold. Kevin managed to notice that his mother was lying motionless on the bed, her face almost black and blue. He called out to her, but of course she didn't respond. Breaking free from Bill's grip, the young man rushed downstairs and Bill followed him. The struggle continued in the kitchen, and then the 2 men tumbled out onto the street, where astonished neighbors watched the unfolding fight. There, Bill tore Kevin's shirt and shorts off. But before that, Kevin managed to grab his phone from his shorts and called 911. Then he ran to the neighbor's house, telling them that his stepfather had killed his mother and waited with them for the police to arrive. When the police questioned Bill, he told a completely different story. The morning of that day started as usual for the family. Bill mowed the lawn and cleaned the pool. Later, he and Kevin were planning to watch NASCAR. But Kevin went upstairs to talk to Diane. Obviously, they started arguing. Bill heard Diane scream at Kevin and thought she had just yelled at her son sharply. But then, it became very quiet. 5 to 10 minutes later, he went upstairs to see what was happening. When he entered the room, Bill saw Kevin looming over his mother, strangling her. Acting quickly, he grabbed the boy by the hands and pushed him out of the room. The fight continued in the kitchen and then spilled onto the street. Bill tried to restrain his son, but he complained that Kevin was stronger and threw him around like a rag doll. When Kevin finally ran down the street, Bill did not pursue him. Instead, he returned to the house and called 911 from the kitchen. He claimed that he did not go back upstairs to check on his wife, whether she was alive or perhaps still breathing, even though he told the operator that he was with Diane and that she definitely wasn't breathing. Naturally, the police took both men in for questioning. Meanwhile, officers interviewed neighbors about what they had witnessed. When one neighbor, about to leave after providing her statement, sighed and said, "It's terrible that this is the second wife who has died in this house." It was a surprising turn that the police had not anticipated. In cases like these, suspicion often falls on the spouse. What was unusual in this case is that Bill had already had one wife who died just 8 months before he met Diane. By the time of her death in 2000, 44-year-old Krista and 42-year-old Bill had been married for 22 years and had raised 5 children in the same house that Kevin and Diane would later move into. On Easter Sunday morning in 2000, Bill found his wife in the pool. While he was pulling her out of the water, their daughter called for an ambulance, but it was already too late. Bruises were found on the woman's head, and investigators concluded that she had left the house at night, tripped, hit her head, and fell into the pool. Bill was never considered a suspect. Her death was deemed accidental. After his wife's death, he received a $250,000 insurance payout. This was only one of the insurance payouts Bill received over the years. It seemed that Bill Kane had incredibly bad luck in both his personal life and business ventures. His auto shop and the property he had invested in both burned down, and he received insurance payouts for them as well. At least one of these incidents was suspected of arson, though it couldn't be proven. Each of these incidents individually did not seem suspicious. However, the overall picture was quite unusual. What added to the suspicion was that Diane was insured for $750,000. Bill was asked to take a polygraph test, and he failed it, lying about 2 key aspects of Diane's murder and what he found his stepson doing over her. As for the DNA evidence, no DNA from her son, who Bill claimed was strangling his mother, was found on Diane's neck. However, there was DNA from her husband on her neck. The police had to disregard this evidence because the spouses shared a bed, loved each other, and it was not unusual for the husband's DNA to be found on his wife. Bill was questioned 3 times. Initially, he denied returning to the bedroom after the fight with his stepson, but during the 911 call, he clearly stated that he was with his wife, trying to help her. When this discrepancy was pointed out during the 3rd interrogation, he admitted to entering the room but lied, claiming he never returned to the bedroom. His contradictory statements raised suspicions. What added to the suspicions was Bill's history of police interactions. Between 1975 and 2014, he had been arrested 4 times for driving under the influence. So Bill did not appear to be an innocent bystander, and he was aware of this himself. However, once investigators began to believe that he was the prime suspect in his wife's murder, they discovered something they didn't know before. Prior to Diane's murder, the police had been called to the family's home several times, and Kevin Kane was involved in these incidents. Kevin always had a volatile temper, and despite some initial sympathy, his relationship with his stepfather had soured. He often behaved like an immature child, taunting his stepfather, saying, "Try hitting me and I'll call the police and they'll arrest you." He frequently called the police himself, and each time the officers found that despite Kevin's calls, he was the problem. However, in recent times his behavior worsened, and he began displaying aggression even towards his mother, insulting and threatening her. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the 23-year-old couldn't hold down a job, constantly complaining of headaches and preferring to spend entire days on the computer. Diane believed that her son was simply lying about his health to avoid work, but to her horror, she found out that he had a brain tumor when she took him to the hospital. He had undergone surgery a month before the murder. However, he had barely begun to recover when his mother and stepfather once again demanded that he find a job and his own place to live. And then, 5 weeks before the deadline for him to move out, she was killed. The evidence gathered at the murder scene, including the 5 small blood drops found on Diane's leg and the blanket, as well as the presence of Kevin's shoes and glasses near the bed, played a crucial role in the investigation. Despite Kevin's claims that he never entered the bedroom, forensic analysis revealed that the shoes and glasses belonged to him. Realizing that he was the prime suspect, Kevin voluntarily took a polygraph test and passed it without any issues. However, the presence of his belongings in the bedroom raised doubts. Furthermore, Kevin's DNA was not found on his mother's neck, and Bill did not mention that Kevin was wearing gloves during the altercation. Nevertheless, Kevin appeared to be the more likely suspect to investigators, given his aggressive behavior during the fight compared to Bill's calm and composed demeanor. The prosecutor, unsure if the evidence against Kevin was sufficient, decided to present the case to a grand jury. If they believed the evidence was insufficient, Kevin would be released. Kevin's lawyers believed that he could give testimony in his favor. However, unbeknownst to Kevin, the prosecutor had just received the laboratory report about the blood drops found on the blanket and Diane's leg. When Kevin took the witness stand, the prosecutor asked him directly how he could explain the presence of his blood in the room if he claimed not to have entered it. Kevin was caught off guard and couldn't provide a satisfactory explanation. This confusion proved costly, as he was subsequently charged with first-degree murder, and the case was sent to trial. Given the stark differences in the men's stories and motives, the prosecution relied heavily on the physical evidence. They couldn't explain how Kevin's blood ended up in the room if he didn't enter it. While Kevin had obvious scratches from the altercation with Bill, his failure to mention wearing gloves and the presence of his personal items in the room painted a suspicious picture. Kevin's defense argued that Bill was the killer, with a clear motive being the $750,000 insurance payout. But they did not inform the jury about Bill's previous wife's death and other insurance payouts. The jury also did not hear about Kevin's 911 call, only Bill's call. Ultimately, the jury did not find anything suspicious in Bill's behavior and did not see reason to doubt Kevin's guilt. They convicted Kevin of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Kevin's lawyers immediately filed an appeal, confident in their client's innocence and believing that the appeal would be granted. The issue at hand was that the prosecutor was allowed to tell the jurors about Kevin and Bill's constant conflicts, how Kevin often called the police to annoy his stepfather. The prosecution argued that this demonstrated Kevin as a troublemaker. They also claimed that Kevin's call after his mother's murder was no different from his previous calls, where he allegedly tried to shift blame onto his stepfather. The prosecutor argued that this information was not significant for the case. Kevin's defense team seized upon this argument, contending that the negative perception of Kevin was formed in the jurors' minds due to this information. They argued that Kevin's disputes with his stepfather had no relevance to any anger he might have had towards his mother or the circumstances of her murder. Furthermore, if this information was not essential to the case, it should be excluded, and a new trial should be conducted. This effectively tied the hands of the appellate court, allowing for another trial. The second trial took place in early 2015. It was held in the same courtroom with the same judge, prosecutor, and even the same prosecution strategy. However, Kevin's lawyers were much more assertive this time, directly accusing Bill of being the killer. Additionally, Kevin took the witness stand. He openly admitted that at the age of 23, he was immature, unpleasant, and rude, even towards his mother. He also stated that his mother was everything to him, giving him no reason to harm her. While allowing some room for maneuver, he added that when he opened the bedroom door, he could have taken 2 steps inside, but he continued to insist that he did not approach the bed. Interestingly, despite the prosecutor's emphasis on the presence of Kevin's blood in the bedroom, the prosecution still could not explain how it got there. There was no blood under Diane's nails, no sharp objects in the room, and no signs that Kevin was bleeding before the altercation with his stepfather. If Bill scratched him, trying to pull him away from Diane, there should have been blood on the staircase, in the kitchen, and outside, where they continued to fight. However, it was evident that Bill scratched Kevin only outside, And since Kevin did not return to the house, the prosecution's expert had to speculate on what might have happened. Her theory suggested that Kevin either spat or coughed blood onto the blanket and his mother's leg. Of course, this theory seemed far-fetched. Kevin was not so unwell that he would cough up blood while killing his mother. So, where did these tiny droplets come from? The defense had a version that appeared more logical and consistent with the evidence. Forensic experts analyzed the hands of Diane, Bill, and Kevin, and the only foreign DNA found was Kevin's under Bill's fingernails. After the altercation, Kevin ran to the neighbors and waited there for the police, while Bill entered the house with Kevin's blood on his fingers. One does not need to be a genius to figure out what happened next. However, the defense could not secure the support of an independent expert because they lacked the funds, as Kevin was represented by court-appointed attorneys. Therefore, the jurors only heard the prosecution's expert. Nevertheless, this time the jurors found reason to doubt, which their predecessors did not, and Kevin was released from prison after several years. When the verdict was delivered, Bill was present in the courtroom with his new wife. He had married for the third time to a woman named Tanya. Unfortunately, this marriage didn't last long, and Tanya passed away from cancer in 2017. The following year, Bill published an autobiography where he described all of his losses. The book was titled Love That Lasts a Lifetime. A year later, he was accused of fleeing the scene of an incident when he rode his motorcycle into a group of cyclists, resulting in one of them ending up in the intensive care unit. However, Bill was not the only one who found himself in legal trouble again. Kevin, who had returned to his original surname Karakesh and promised to become the person his mother wanted him to be, was arrested in 2016 after a brawl at a pool hall. He struck his opponent with a billiard triangle. Afterward, he settled in Sarasota, Florida, and seemed to lead a rather quiet life. The murder of Diane Kane remains unsolved. Her husband and son continue to accuse each other of being the murderer, and there is no doubt that one of them is right. It is not possible to try the son again. The prosecution naturally insists that they did not make a mistake with the murderer and have no intention of charging Bill. Even before dawn on a chilly September morning in 1994, 18-year-old Bonnie Craig left home with a backpack on her back. 3 times a week, the University of Alaska student would wake up very early to make sure she wouldn't miss her first class. She took pride in never being late for her studies, but on this day, Bonnie never showed up for her classes. Later that same day, another university student was taking pictures in a scenic park when she made a horrifying discovery. Bonnie Christine Craig was born in Calgary, Alberta, Canada on March 30th, 1976. At the age of 3, Bonnie's father was replaced by her stepfather, Gary Campbell, for her and her older brother. He adored the children, and soon Bonnie had 2 more younger siblings, Adam and Samantha. They always looked up to their beloved older sister, who was caring, kind, and full of life. She excelled at everything she set her mind to, especially in academics and sports. She became the first girl at her university to engage in wrestling. Due to Gary's work, the family frequently moved. Bonnie attended 8 different schools, which taught her how to quickly adapt to new environments. Despite Karen and Gary deciding to divorce a few years later, Bonnie adored her stepfather and chose to live with him. Moreover, Gary's house was only 15 minutes away from the university where Bonnie enrolled. She chose to major in psychology at the University of Alaska in snowy and cold Anchorage. Not everyone would call Alaska paradise, but Bonnie and her siblings liked it much more than California or Texas. Perhaps one of the reasons why Bonnie wanted to live in Alaska was Cameron Miyasaki, her boyfriend. He was a year older than her, and they seemed to be made for each other. After graduating from an Anchorage school, Cameron headed to California to study architecture, but they stayed in touch via phone calls and emails. Unfortunately, Bonnie's life was not entirely without clouds. At a very young age, she experienced a serious tragedy. Her best friend died due to drunk driving. This event changed Bonnie's life and unexpectedly influenced future events. After her friend's death, Bonnie promised never to drink alcohol and never to get behind the wheel. She categorically refused to drive, preferring to walk or use public transportation. Fortunately, Gary's house was close to her university, which was very convenient. She would take the public bus to her classes 3 times a week, and walked the 3-kilometer distance from her father's house to the bus stop. On other days, she worked part-time at a supermarket. The path to the bus stop partially led along a remote road, and it could be dangerous, especially for a girl walking alone in the pre-dawn darkness. Bonnie was aware of the hidden dangers and even told her sister that she always needed to carry pepper spray. She had one, but would it be enough if someone attacked her with the vilest intentions? On the morning of September 28, 1994, Bonnie woke up at 5 o'clock, got ready, and, as usual, headed to the bus stop. It was a 45-minute walk, so even though classes started at 7 o'clock, she always left early to make sure she wouldn't be late. Samantha heard her sister get up and hurriedly prepare for her classes. She was confident that Bonnie had made it to her English class, which she had been preparing for all evening. 9 hours later, another student was taking photos on the Chugach Trail in the park south of Anchorage. It was located 25 kilometers from Bonnie's home, and it offered stunning photography opportunities. When the student focused her camera on the picturesque surroundings, something caught her attention. Something was floating in the water beneath a 10-meter cliff, and this bright blue object seemed unnatural against the rushing white foam of the water. Sharpening the focus, the girl realized with horror that it was a woman. Her lifeless body was floating in the shallow river. In 1994, the girl didn't have a mobile phone, of course, so she rushed to the parking lot, got into her car, and drove to the nearest phone, where she dialed 911. The police officers from the state of Alaska responded to the call. The woman, still very young, was floating face down at the base of a high cliff. Today, in 2023, there is a barrier on that cliff, but in 1994, it didn't exist. So if a person was walking there, tripped and fell, they could easily have suffered a fatal injury. Initially, the police thought that's what had happened. The forensic expert made a preliminary conclusion that Bonnie had drowned, but had also sustained several serious head injuries, possibly during the fall. She didn't have a purse or a backpack with her, but there was a ring, Bonnie Craig's university ring. The police needed to contact her family, and by the time the officers were certain it was Bonnie and knocked on the door of the family's home, it was 10 in the evening. Gary, Samantha, and Adam were waiting for Bonnie any minute. The children were eavesdropping on the stairs when they saw their father fall to his knees and break down in tears after hearing the officer's words. They realized that something had happened to their sister, but hoped that she was in the hospital and everything would be okay. It turned out to be not the case. Bonnie's mother, Karen, was vacationing on a yacht in Florida with her new boyfriend at the time. She never for a moment believed the police report that her daughter could have died while taking a walk in the park when she was supposed to be in class. How did she get there without a car? And why did she go there in the first place? She considered it nonsense. She was convinced that it wasn't her daughter. However, when she arrived for identification, she had to admit that it was Bonnie lying on the morgue table. But Karen noticed something else. There were clear defensive injuries on her daughter's arms. She immediately asked the officers if they had collected any evidence at the crime scene. However, they replied that it was just an unfortunate accident, and there was nothing to collect. Had she been assaulted? Where were her belongings? Karen had a lot of questions, but the investigators weren't willing to share information with her. Karen, who had worked as a reporter, knew exactly what to do. She turned to the media, giving interviews and drawing as much attention as possible to her daughter's case, insisting that it was a murder. The police asked her to stop and not interfere with the investigation. But what investigation could there be if her daughter's death was being treated as an accident? She continued to make noise persistently. In reality, detectives were indeed investigating this case as a homicide, but they didn't want to disclose it to Bonnie's family or the media. They chose this tactic because they believed the crime was committed by someone close to the victim, possibly even a family member or boyfriend, and they feared that if the perpetrator sensed danger, they might go into hiding. After conducting an autopsy, the forensic expert concluded that Bonnie had been murdered, receiving 11 blows to the head with an unidentified object. She had a broken finger and abrasions on intimate parts of her body. Semen was found on her body and clothing. Additionally, an officer discovered a piece of paper with a drop of blood 2 meters from the edge of the cliff. The presence of blood in that location should not have occurred in the case of an accident. This means that something happened before she fell from the cliff. However, there were no other pieces of evidence or signs of struggle. At least 2 people had seen Bonnie walking to the bus stop, but there was no evidence that she boarded the bus. The police concluded that the killer had intercepted her while she was walking on the road in the darkness. Officers requested DNA samples, fingerprints, and hair from all family members. Karen was surprised by the need for the children's samples. Then an officer confessed to her that they actually needed Gary's sample, but it would look suspicious if they only took his DNA. Karen wondered if Gary could be related to Bonnie's death. According to Gary, Bonnie had told him she wanted to be buried in Canada, but maybe he wanted to send her body far from Anchorage. Moreover, on the day of her death, he shouldn't have been home. He was on a business trip and came back early for some unclear reason. He had also been upset when Bonnie didn't return home on time, even though she was supposed to be looking after their younger siblings. But could he have been so angry as to harm her? Gary had always treated Bonnie like his own daughter, but doubts were forming in Karen's mind. However, the DNA analysis did not yield any matches. Additionally, Samantha and Adam, the younger children, stated that on the morning of the murder, their father was at home, clearing ice from the car before heading to work. While the police were collecting DNA samples from nearly all the men Bonnie had interacted with, Karen decided to conduct her own investigation, because the officers were avoiding her and not sharing information. Frustrated, Karen decided to start her own investigation by retracing her daughter's steps. At 5 o'clock in the morning, she set out from Gary's house to understand where Bonnie might have been abducted. The first part of the journey seemed relatively safe, with houses and streetlights on both sides of the road, and she could walk on the larger sidewalks without getting too close to the road. However, soon the houses and sidewalks disappeared, and Karen found herself walking on a road surrounded by dense woods. Here, Karen encountered a moose. Meeting a moose in Alaska is quite common, but when these animals defend their territory, they can behave quite aggressively. Karen didn't know what to do and hid behind a street lamp. The moose eventually left, but then trouble arose again. Two people stopped to help Karen, a truck driver and a police officer. This gave Karen food for thought. Of course, Bonnie would never have gotten into a stranger's car. But if she had been attacked by a wild animal, she might have accepted an offer of a ride in desperation. On the other hand, it would have been risky for the killer because the road was patrolled by police officers. Karen was amazed at how dangerous the path was that her daughter had taken in the dark several times a week. But she understood that Bonnie had never complained to her because she didn't want her mother to worry and forbid her to live with her stepfather, as Alaska had become her home. In January 1995, 5 months after Bonnie's death, and seeing Karen's persistence, the police gave her what she desperately needed. They allowed her to see the report from the medical examiner, but didn't permit her to discuss it with anyone. The woman received confirmation of what she already knew. Her daughter had been sexually assaulted and then killed. Now the police were looking for a DNA match. It's important to note that CODIS, the FBI's DNA database, was in its infancy, launched 4 years before Bonnie's death, and it wouldn't be fully operational until 1998. This means that until the police find a suspect, they won't get a match. Crossing out Gary and Cameron from the list of suspects, as Cameron was in a different state, investigators found that one of Bonnie's colleagues at the supermarket was overly infatuated with her. The girl even complained to her manager about the guy when he used a work computer to find out her phone number. He didn't stop calling her despite all her requests to stop. Another colleague missed a work meeting that was scheduled around the same time Bonnie was killed. 2 guys provided DNA samples, and it turned out to be a false lead. At the same time, Karen unexpectedly discovered that she might have a connection to her daughter's murder. It turns out that for the past 3 years, she had been working as a reserve officer in the Anchorage Police Department. Reserve officers are called upon when the police need additional assistance. Karen was used for undercover operations, posing as a buyer of illegal substances to catch dealers. The police did everything possible to hide her identity during operations, ensuring that no one saw her face or heard her voice. However, after the arrest of 7 associates of a local criminal organization, a fellow police officer secretly shared his thoughts with her. He was convinced that after Karen participated in the arrest, the gang leader targeted her family. The informant explained that Bonnie might have been killed as a message to the Anchorage Police Department to leave them alone. Perhaps the criminals wanted to eliminate her because she had once lived at that address, and her daughter could easily be mistaken for her, especially in the darkness. Of course, Karen immediately reported this to the detective working on Bonnie's case, but she didn't like the response she received. After sharing all the information, the detective was more interested in knowing the source of her information. He accused her of interfering with the investigation and refused to pursue her theory. Years later, Karen was convinced that the detectives had dismissed this lead, but she was mistaken. A year later, Karen unexpectedly learned that the police were working on a new lead. Bonnie's English teacher, whose class Bonnie was planning to attend that morning, called her. The teacher told the police that one of Bonnie's classmates might be responsible for her death. She had assigned her students the task of keeping a journal, and she was alarmed by how dark and filled with rage one student's journal was, particularly when he mentioned the date of September 28th, the day Bonnie was murdered. He wrote that it would be a tough day. What made it suspicious was that the student had skipped her class for 7 hours on that very day, and when he later turned in his assignment to the teacher, he was soaking wet, as if he had just come out of the shower, and he smelled like he had sprayed himself with an entire bottle of cologne. After reading the student's journal, Karen was convinced she had found a lead to her daughter's killer. If he attended classes at the same time as Bonnie, she might not have been afraid to get into his car, and the cologne could have concealed the smell of pepper spray. It was the most significant lead she had come across. Karen asked the investigators to examine the journal, but the police responded that they had already taken a DNA sample from the student and would only look at the journal if there was a match. This approach made sense in terms of saving time and police resources, but what if there were 2 attackers and only one of them had assaulted Bonnie? Karen was disappointed with the police's response and once again took it upon herself to investigate the life of the suspicious student. She found out that the student had been charged with assault but was released on bail, which was posted by his friend, who was also accused of murder. In other words, the student associated with questionable individuals. And furthermore, he appeared at the crime scene in the park when the police were removing Bonnie's body. Upon learning all of this, Karen concluded that her boyfriend's friend had committed the murder and already imagined how the 2 suspects would soon be arrested. But a few weeks later, the sergeant informed her that the DNA didn't match. Karen's disappointment knew no bounds, and she still had no doubt that somehow one of her boyfriend's associates was connected to her daughter's murder. The investigation had come full circle. Detectives were hoping to find a breakthrough in Bonnie's daily schedule. Around 5:20 a.m. on that day, a girl delivering newspapers saw Bonnie and accurately described her clothing. Another witness noticed an unfamiliar car parked in front of Bonnie's house, idling. An anonymous tipster reported seeing Bonnie talking to 2 brunette men in a car at a bus stop. But the most intriguing testimonies came from a retired surgeon who regularly jogged in the mornings. He saw a girl matching Bonnie's description at 10 a.m., walking with 2 guys and another girl. The man provided a detailed description of Bonnie's clothing: a blue denim jacket, a white scarf, white or khaki jeans, and white sneakers. He couldn't remember the color of her shirt, but remembered her because of his medical knowledge. Bonnie had an epicanthic fold, a fold of skin on the upper eyelid, often referred to as Mongolian fold. He saw Bonnie on the street and later recognized her in a newspaper photo. The police investigated all these leads, but the investigation did not move forward. 3 years into the case, a significant lead emerged, primarily related to DNA. The new suspect was the driver of the same bus that Bonnie was supposed to take. Several women and girls accused the driver of harassment. Before this, he worked as a substitute teacher in Pennsylvania, from where he was dismissed due to inappropriate comments towards female students. Shortly after Bonnie's murder, the man moved to California, but the most crucial aspect was the potential DNA match. The man's lawyer immediately demanded another test using more advanced technology, and it turned out to be another false lead. Semen found on Bonnie's body belonged to a different man. Furthermore, the driver had an alibi. Why did the DNA samples initially match? Because the initial DNA comparison was done using 12 markers. Over time, technology became more sophisticated, providing much more accurate information. It had been 12 years since that morning when Bonnie left home and never returned. The investigation was handled by a team working on old, unsolved cases when they were informed about a DNA match. The police immediately informed Karen, who greeted the news with skepticism. She quickly asked if the analysis could be trusted this time. When they told her they were 100% sure this time, a whirlwind of questions raced through her mind. Who was the new suspect? Did he work with her daughter, go to school with her, or know her classmate? But the answer stunned her because it was something she couldn't even imagine. He wasn't one of those already questioned by the officers. The suspect had come into the sight of the Alaska police solely thanks to the DNA CODIS database. He had long left the state and was currently serving time in a prison in New Hampshire. The suspect's name was Kenneth Dion. and in 1994 he was 25 years old, which made him 7 years older than Bonnie. He was arrested in New Hampshire in connection with a robbery in 2003, but his DNA sample was only added to the database in 2006. Investigators immediately flew to New Hampshire. During Kenneth's interrogation, he remained relaxed and answered questions as if he were old friends with the officers. He didn't ask why detectives from Alaska had flown all the way to talk to him. Kenneth shared that he was deeply involved in Eastern martial arts and had ranked 10th in a World Wrestling Championship. He loved using nunchucks and sayes, which he always kept in his car. The detective gradually steered the conversation toward what interested him most, and Kenneth revealed that in 1994 he was married and had just welcomed a daughter. He confessed that his family had been the best thing in his life, but everything spiraled out of control when he started using drugs. Although he managed to quit briefly and enlist in the military when he served in Anchorage, he was discharged from the Army due to drug-related issues. The detective casually inquired whether he kept up with the news while living in Alaska and whether he remembered a girl named Bonnie. Kenneth noticeably tensed up, but her name and photo didn't trigger any memories. After all, where could a grown, married man and drug user have met a diligent 18-year-old freshman, he wondered. Where indeed? That was what the detectives had to find out. Kenneth finally realized where the investigators were heading and demanded a lawyer. Meanwhile, the police continued digging. It turned out that Kenneth had been released on parole 2 months before Bonnie's murder and was rearrested 2 months after it for violating the conditions of his parole. In total, the young man had been accused of crimes 18 times, 8 of which were serious offenses. According to his former girlfriend, Kenneth boasted that he could kill someone and get away with it. Supposedly, he had killed someone in Alaska and couldn't go back there. The prosecutor wasn't sure if there was enough evidence for a conviction, so they offered Kenneth a plea deal of 75 years in prison, which he refused. In 2007, he was charged with first- and second-degree murder and assault on Bonnie. He couldn't be charged with kidnapping because the statute of limitations had expired. The extradition process and legal nuances took a lot of time, but finally, in 2011, Kenneth appeared before a judge in Alaska. Kenneth's attorneys acted quite persistently and aggressively. They constructed their version of events around the idea that on September 28th, there was an unfortunate accident. Bonnie Craig was walking in the park, tripped and fell, and Kenneth wasn't even near the park that day. As indirect evidence, they cited the words of a newspaper girl and other witnesses, none of whom claimed to have seen a red-haired man or his black Ford Tempo. Moreover, they argued that if he had struck the girl 11 times in the head, there should have been a significant amount of blood at the scene. As for the DNA found on the girl's body, her clothing and jeans, Kenneth recalled that he did, in fact, know Bonnie, and they had consensual intimate relations before the day of the incident. In essence, the defense tried to paint a picture where Bonnie had a double life and was involved with other men behind her boyfriend Cameron's back. But this theory appeared to be far-fetched. The defense's version failed to explain how the girl made her way to the park without a car, where she left her backpack, and why she didn't shower or change clothes for several days, especially when Kenneth's semen was found on her clothing and jeans. On the other hand, the prosecutor faced a challenging task. He had only DNA evidence and nothing else to link Kenneth to the murder. There were no witnesses, no apparent motive, and no murder weapon. Even establishing that a murder had occurred proved to be a complex endeavor. The forensic expert stated that the girl had been struck 11 times in the head, and the injuries from the blows were consistent with being hit by an object, which could not have resulted from a fall from a cliff. There was also a drop of blood found on a leaf at the cliff's edge, indicating that something occurred up there. Remarkably, the family wasn't even aware of this piece of evidence. They only discovered it 16 years later. As for why only a drop of blood was found at the crime scene, according to the prosecutor's theory, the attack on Bonnie began in the car. Presumably, she tried to resist using her self-defense skills, but the man with a black belt in Eastern martial arts overpowered her. He brought her to the park, assaulted her, and she managed to escape, either by jumping or falling into the water. Kenneth then followed her into the water and used nunchucks or a sickle to attack her until she perished. The jury believed the prosecution's version and found Kenneth guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to 124 years in prison and could potentially be eligible for parole at the age of 80. It was only during the trial, when Karen saw the video of the officers meticulously investigating the area near the cliff on their knees, working in the water meter by meter, that she realized they had taken the investigation seriously from the very beginning and did not consider the incident to be an accident. For all those years, she had wrongly blamed them for inaction, even though they had never ceased the investigation. Furthermore, Karen recognized the crucial role that DNA played in this case and began actively advocating for states to collect DNA samples from all individuals incarcerated or arrested for serious crimes. Initially, only 6 states supported this idea. Karen presented her arguments to the then governor of Alaska, and within 12 days, they were able to draft and pass the corresponding law. Today, all states collect DNA samples from individuals accused of serious crimes.
On February 28, 2018, the residents of Spain celebrated Andalusia Day as usual, and the students enjoyed additional days off. One of those happy schoolchildren was 8-year-old Gabriel Cruz. So that he wouldn't get bored, Gabriel's father, Angel Cruz, decided to make him happy by taking him to his grandmother's house. Angel was divorced from Gabriel's mother, Patricia, but the former spouses maintained a very warm relationship for the sake of their child. Therefore, Gabriel's mother easily agreed to let him go to his grandmother's house, and Angel took the child to his mother, who lived in Las Hortichuelas. On the morning of February 27, 2018, the boy spent his time playing with his cousins, who lived next door to his grandmother. Around lunchtime, Gabriel returned to his grandmother's house to eat, after which he started asking again to be allowed to play with the girls because he wanted to have a bit more fun. At first, his grandmother refused, as he needed to take a short nap, but he kept persuading her, and eventually, the woman agreed. She looked out the window and watched as the boy ran towards the girls. In reality, their houses were just 100 meters apart, almost in a straight line. For Gabriel, it was a common thing to run back and forth since they were really close to each other. The grandmother saw how the child disappeared around the corner, which meant he had already reached the girl's place. It was a completely safe neighborhood, where everyone knew and got along with each other, so she wasn't worried at all. The boy left the house at around 3:30 to 3:45 p.m., but he never showed up at the relative's house. Since they didn't know that Gabriel was heading their way, it never occurred to them to be alarmed. The grandmother also assumed he was still playing with his cousins. Therefore, the family only realized that Gabriel was missing around 6 p.m. when the grandmother was waiting for him for dinner, and he hadn't returned. The grandmother called Patricia and Angel, and the boy's parents decided to contact the police. The investigation began. One of the hypotheses was that the boy simply got lost, but the parents couldn't believe it because Gabriel knew the area perfectly well, and the route from one house to another was a straight path he walked several times a day. Another version suggested that a criminal gang had kidnapped the boy to demand a ransom. However, Gabriel's parents were simple workers, and it was unlikely they could come up with a large sum of money on short notice. Through the media, Patricia and Angel appealed to the kidnappers or anyone who knew the child's whereabouts. They shared that Gabriel was a very kind, obedient, and loving child. They affectionately called him Fish because he adored the sea and dreamed of becoming a marine biologist at his young age. They cried and begged anyone who might know something about the child's location to help them, offering a reward of 10,000 euros, which friends, colleagues, and neighbors had gathered for the family. Volunteers distributed flyers describing the boy as wearing black pants, a white t-shirt, and a red hoodie. Meanwhile, search teams were formed. The searches, in which the police combed every corner within a radius of 6 and then 12 kilometers, continued for several days. Helicopters, search dogs and, of course, volunteers assisted in the search for the boy. Among them was a girl named Ana Julia Quezada, who was Angel's girlfriend. It was she who made a crucial discovery in this case. Together with Angel, she was searching for Gabriel, and in the bushes 3.5 kilometers from the boy's grandmother's house, she found a white t-shirt. The t-shirt was lying near the Nijar water treatment plant, Aguilla Ravine and Las Negras water treatment plant. Anna recognized Gabriel's t-shirt because she had helped the boy get dressed that day. Laboratory tests confirmed that it had Gabriel's DNA on it. In other words, it was indeed his t-shirt. But where was the rest of his clothing and the boy himself? The public was relieved by the discovery, but for the police, it was strange because they had already searched that area and found nothing. Meanwhile, all the attention of journalists and the public was focused on a 42-year-old man named Diego Elfa because he suddenly became the main suspect in the police investigation. Diego had a strong attraction to Patricia, Gabriel's mother. At first, Patricia reciprocated his feelings, but it became overwhelming and obsessive. He became infatuated with Patricia, constantly calling her, showing up at her workplace, and worst of all, even going to Gabriel's school to intercept Patricia there. Additionally, Diego suffered from psychological disorders, and Patricia had to seek a restraining order against him through official channels. Even this did not deter him. Eventually, he was arrested, and upon release, he was equipped with an ankle bracelet to monitor his movements. Diego fit the profile of someone who might seek revenge. He knew the child, knew his mother, and could potentially blackmail Patricia. Moreover, he exhibited enough signs of mental instability to commit such an act. He later managed to remove the ankle bracelet, and continued to call Patricia. He was apprehended for violating the terms of his release, and the police searched his house and car. Everything seemed to point to Diego as the prime suspect at first glance. But, in reality, things were not quite as straightforward as they seemed. Indeed, investigators quickly dismissed the idea that Diego could be the kidnapper. Firstly, he lived 40 kilometers away from the place of the child's disappearance. Additionally, the police found 3 witnesses who saw Diego on the balcony of his house around 4:45 p.m. Considering that Gabriel had left his grandmother's house just before 4:30 p.m., Diego couldn't have possibly kidnapped the child, hidden him somewhere, and returned in such a short time. It was clear that he couldn't be in multiple places at once. Therefore, for a while, investigators pretended that Diego was their main suspect. However, secretly, they focused on Anna's behavior. One of the primary concerns for the investigators was that the t-shirt found by Anna was completely dry. This raised suspicions because it had been raining heavily for several days before the discovery. On the day she found the t-shirt in the bushes, there was no rain, but there should have been traces indicating that the t-shirt had been exposed to rain for several days. This placed Anna in the investigators' spotlight. Furthermore, she claimed that she and Angel found the t-shirt together. However, in reality, she found it while he was slightly behind her. It was also curious that Anna claimed to have sensed Gabriel's scent, leading her to find the t-shirt, even though the search teams couldn't find it. Moreover, Anna seemed to overplay her concern for the child, particularly when the cameras were on her. She appeared agitated, but at home, she showed no signs of distress. Her strange behavior was noticed not only by acquaintances but also by journalists and even Angel. Nevertheless, she continued shedding tears, demonstrating excessive anxiety. Strangely, she and Gabriel had a troubled relationship, and he openly expressed his dissatisfaction with her. Gabriel was never rude or spoiled, but he told Anna the truth. When asked for her phone, she claimed to have lost it, but when she allegedly found it, most of its contents were deleted. However, all these elements hardly qualified as evidence, so the police tried not to show their suspicions to avoid scaring Anna away. Subsequently, the investigators placed Anna under constant surveillance, tapped her phone, and installed a listening device in her car. Now, they needed to set a trap to catch her making a mistake and lead them to the child. The investigators contacted Angel and Anna and asked them to provide the key to a remote farm owned by Angel. They claimed they wanted to conduct a search there the next day as a precaution. Angel agreed to give the key and allowed them to search the farm. On the early morning of March 11, 2018, Anna began to act. She got into her car and headed to the farm. Interestingly, at that moment, she was not only being followed by the police but also by journalists, who found her behavior strange. When she arrived at the farm, she got out of the car with a blanket, and upon her return, something was clearly wrapped in the blanket. She placed the blanket in the trunk and headed to the house where she lived with Angel. When she was about to enter the garage of the house, the police stopped her. In the trunk of her car, they found the body of Gabriel. The arrest was captured on video by neighbors of the woman. Anna was shouting that she didn't understand anything and was not guilty, claiming that she had simply taken the car in the morning. However, at that moment, she was unaware that she had been under constant surveillance. Interestingly, Angel had known for several days that the police suspected his girlfriend, but he, along with Patricia, was asked to keep calm and not show any signs that Anna was the main suspect. It was incredibly brave of him to handle the situation, and it must have been incredibly difficult for him to sleep in the same bed as someone who could have killed his son. During the interrogation, the woman partially confessed to the murder of Gabriel but claimed it was an accident. She said she intercepted Gabriel when he was heading to his cousin's house. She told the boy that she was going to the farm to paint something and offered him to come along, promising they would quickly return. Gabriel got into the car with her, and they arrived at the farm. However, as her story unfolded, it became less credible. Anna recounted that Gabriel grabbed an axe and started yelling that he didn't like her, didn't want her dating his father, and wanted her to go back to the Dominican Republic. She claimed that at some point, she put her hand on him and managed to take the axe away. Supposedly, he continued yelling at her, and she wanted him to be quiet, so she covered his mouth and nose with her hands. She cried and swore that it was an accident. However, the autopsy revealed that besides being asphyxiated, Gabriel was also struck on the head and strangled for about 45 minutes, indicating a slow and agonizing death. Anna could have saved his life by calling for help, but she didn't. Afterward, Anna undressed Gabriel down to his underwear and buried his body in a shallow grave on the farm. She then covered the body with stones, got back into the car, and returned. On March 5th, she took his belongings and threw them into a glass recycling bin in a nearby neighborhood. After falling into the police trap, she hurried to the farm, exhumed the body, wrapped it in a blanket, and placed it in the car's trunk. The police had installed several listening devices in her car, which recorded her making derogatory remarks about the child on the way back. She lamented that they needed the boy and would get him. It's entirely unclear what she planned to do with him when they were caught, especially since she intended to take him to the garage of the house where she lived with Angel. At first, the police suspected she had an accomplice because they searched all the family cars, including Angel, Patricia, Anna, and other relatives, but found no traces of soil or blood. However, they later dismissed this theory and only charged Anna. The motives for the crime could have been twofold: money and jealousy. Firstly, Anna was jealous of Angel's relationship with his son and felt excluded from their close bond. Angel adored his child, and despite the separation, they had a wonderful relationship. They cared for the child and remained united through him. When Anna planned another trip to the Dominican Republic, Angel refused her request as he wanted to spend time with his son during that period. Obviously, all of these situations bothered Anna. Secondly, there was a motive related to money, partially supported by the fact that Anna was the one who spoke the most about increasing the reward for information about the boy. Additionally, her ex-lover's daughter mentioned that Anna was very calculating and greedy, and there were incidents when she could have killed him but refrained from calling for help when he was unwell, while they were living together. Anna came to Spain at the age of 21 and settled in Almeria. She worked as a prostitute in the Dominican Republic and met her ex-husband, who was a truck driver. He decided to rescue her from that profession and brought her to Spain. The family raised their daughter, but when they decided to move to Spain, they left Anna's older daughter, 4-year-old Josefina, behind in her homeland. Unfortunately, in 1996, Anna's older daughter died under mysterious circumstances. Her husband woke up one morning and went to the children's room to check on the girls. He couldn't find Josefina but noticed a small table near the window. When he approached, he saw the girl lying on the asphalt below. She had fallen from the 7th floor. The police arrived, but they couldn't question the mother as she was in a state of shock. The case was considered an accident. Now, after the revelation that Anna killed Gabriel, there are discussions about the possibility that Anna might also be responsible for her daughter's death. However, investigating the case after almost 20 years is practically impossible, especially since an official decision had already been made, stating it was an accident. The trial for Gabriel's case took place in 2019. The defense requested 3 years of imprisonment for Anna for unintentional manslaughter, but that plea was rejected. Instead, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. She might be eligible for conditional release after 25 years. That means she could potentially be released in 2044, but only if she can demonstrate rehabilitation. Even if she is released, she won't be allowed to live in Niger or approach the child's parents within 500 meters. She is also obligated to pay the child's parents €250,000 for moral damages and reimburse the state for the costs of the search for the child. In short, the guilty party received the maximum punishment and is currently serving her sentence in prison. One might think that Gabriel's family could now move on and remember what a wonderful boy he was, forgetting about the media. However, that's not the case. Numerous posts have appeared on the internet, inviting people to visit certain websites to see the body of the deceased Gabriel. If one followed these links, they would see a child's face, but it was a horrifically mutilated body of a different child. There were also other methods to gain likes or make money by exploiting images of children. This happens because the law doesn't protect the privacy of deceased individuals as it does for the living. Now, Gabriel's parents are fighting to ensure that relatives of deceased children, whose images are being used in such a manner, have the right to demand the removal of such images or even entire websites.
In 1985, a new autumn semester began at a small college in Boonville, Mississippi. However, the joy of meeting fellow classmates was soon overshadowed by a dreadful piece of news. A call was received by the police from the college, providing information that 18-year-old freshman Stacy Pannell had been found brutally murdered in her dormitory room. Within minutes, the police were already working at the crime scene. The room where the student was found was illuminated only by the dim light of a decorative bar sign, serving as an adornment. By turning on flashlights, the officers were able to discern blood everywhere, on the girl's head, the floor, the bed, and even the walls. The first examination of the body provided the investigators with little information. The girl's shirt was lifted, and her undergarments were displaced, only held on by her left leg. Evidently, she had been violated, after which she was killed with a wooden rifle that was lying on the floor beside the bed. This rifle belonged to Stacy herself, which she used during parades. The rifle was wrapped in a towel, as if the killer tried to erase their fingerprints from it. It was also interesting that someone had cut the protective screen on the room's window. The other part of the screen was lying on the ground directly beneath the window from the street side. Investigators concluded that the killer had entered the room through the window, violated Stacy, and then killed her with her own rifle. Stacy Diane Pannell was the eldest of 3 children in her family. The 18-year-old student was described as a friendly girl, always ready to help a friend. She was part of the marching band in her high school years and was so passionate about it that she continued her involvement in the band in college. Overall, the impression was that everyone loved the freshman, yet someone wished her harm. The detectives began the investigation with an interview of Stacy's roommates, Amy Wheeler and Stephanie Lynn Alexander. Amy recounted that she returned to the dormitory around 2:30 in the morning. She left her keys in the room and couldn't get in, so she knocked on the door and called Stacy's name, but there was no response. She then went to the neighboring room 112 and knocked, On that day, Stephanie was unwell and had taken strong painkillers, making her very drowsy. Nevertheless, Amy managed to wake her up, and she let her in. A unique feature of the dormitory was that there was a shared bathroom between the two rooms used by all the girls, and through it, Amy could enter her room. She entered the room first and noticed Stacy lying on the bed. Turning to Stephanie, who was standing right behind her, Amy said that something was wrong with Stacy. One of the girl's legs was hanging off the bed, a pillow rested on her head, and she was in such a strange position that the friends speculated she might have had too much to drink. Only when Amy attempted to adjust Stacy more comfortably did she notice bloodstains. Amy immediately contacted the campus security. The autopsy of Stacy's body revealed a horrific scene of what transpired that night. The killer struck her with the wooden rifle so violently that it pierced her skull and tore the skin from her ear. The victim endured numerous blows, but did not die instantly. Surprisingly, there were almost no defensive wounds on her, indicating that either she was not expecting the attack or did not have time to defend herself. To the police's surprise, the results showed that there was no sexual assault on the young woman. However, it was evident that the perpetrator had touched her clothing while undressing her, potentially leaving behind a DNA sample. But DNA analysis was not yet conducted in those years. There were no fingerprint databases either, so the police had to take fingerprints from all the boys who had ever entered the girls' room, such as when they were invited to parties, as well as from members of Stacy's group. The dormitory was not a home where only a few family members lived. In college, people constantly came and went. As a result, forensic experts conducted extensive work, which, unfortunately, yielded no results. Therefore, the police turned to the FBI for help in creating a profile of the killer. They determined that the perpetrator was a strong and sturdy man between the ages of 20 and 24. Most likely, he had no previous run-ins with the police or prior legal troubles, and he took the opportunity to attack the girl because he either studied or worked at the college. Without having a large number of clues, the investigators interviewed Stacy's roommates about what was happening in her life before the murder. They found out that she was dating a guy named Tommy Osborne, and after the band rehearsal that day, she met him as usual. The police searched his room, hoping to find some evidence such as blood-stained clothing, weapons, or something similar, but there was nothing like that in his room. Moreover, there were no clues in Stacy's room that would have linked the guy to the murder. No hair, no fingerprints. Having crossed off Stacy's new boyfriend from the list of suspects, the police asked her parents if she had any old friends she had recently broken up with, and such a person was found. Ben Cox was Stacy's boyfriend in high school. The young people dated all summer before Stacy went to college, and Ben even gave her a ring. But when she arrived for her studies, Stacy decided that she no longer wanted to be engaged to Ben. This greatly upset the guy, and he even refused to take the ring back. Ben was put through a polygraph test twice, and the results were inconclusive. The guy quickly became the top suspect of the detective, but although Ben had a motive, it was not enough to link him to the crime. He had an alibi. He was at home all evening and went to bed around 11 o'clock, as confirmed by his parents. As for the physical evidence that would link Ben to the crime scene, the police found a hair on Stacy's bed linen, but the forensic experts could not determine to whom it belonged. It could have been either Ben's hair or someone else's. Stacy's family was convinced it wasn't him because he sincerely cared about the girl. Whoever the killer was, besides wiping the murder weapon, he left few clues. Investigators searched for leads for months, trying to solve the murder of the student, but came no closer to an arrest. Deciding to re-examine the crime scene, they returned to the cut screen in the girl's room. Amy and Stephanie clearly stated that there was no cut before Stacy's murder, meaning that the killer definitely did it. It seemed that this was how he must have entered if he wanted to remain unnoticed. However, the cut turned out to be too small for a person of normal size to squeeze through, let alone a strong young man. If he didn't enter through the window, why spend time fiddling with the screen? On closer inspection, the forensic experts noticed that the fibers of the fiberglass from which the screen was made were pointing outward, which means the killer cut it while being inside the room. Since one could enter the dormitory only with a key, there were only 3 possible options. The killer worked at the college and had a key. He lived in the dorm, or someone let him in. The case had hit a dead end again, and the police sought the help of Steve Rhodes, the police chief from the suburb of Illinois, known for his use of a range of techniques that allowed him to judge whether a suspect was lying based on body language. He planned to talk to Amy, Stephanie, Tommy, and Ben again. The detective first questioned Amy. He spoke to her for 45 minutes and stated that she was not making anything up or hiding anything. Stephanie followed her. As Rhodes recalled, he started the conversation with Stephanie with a series of simple questions. What is her name, address, phone number, date, and place of birth? As she answered, Rhodes watched her eyes closely. With each response, they looked to the left. Finally, Rhodes asked her how Stacy was killed. The girl's eyes flicked to the right. She replied that she didn't know. Who had the opportunity to kill Stacy? He asked another question. Again, she replied that she didn't know, and again her eyes turned to the right. The same reaction to the question about the murderer's motive. For Rhodes, this was a signal. His questions became more specific. For example, he asked her what time she went to bed. The girl's eyes flicked to the right again, and before she could say anything, Rhodes stopped her. "Don't answer me, Stephanie, that's not true. You said you took a shower, Stephanie. Why?" Her eyes went right again. "Damn it, Stephanie," Rhodes exclaimed impatiently, not allowing the girl to say a word. "You're making it all up. I want to hear the truth." Today, pseudoscientific techniques of neuro-linguistic programming are known to many, but at that time, they were new, emerging only a few years ago. According to this approach, in particular, people turn their eyes in a certain way when they lie and when they tell the truth. Thus, Rhodes continued to press her for another 2 hours. Every time Stephanie's eyes turned to the right, the man interrupted her and did not let her speak. Every time she looked to the left, he allowed her to continue, encouraging her. So word by word, he forced her to confess that she killed Stacy in the heat of an argument and sign a confession. Stephanie confessed that she went to Stacy's room to chat. The girls were discussing their boyfriends. Stacy asked what Stephanie thought of Tommy Osborne, and when she said she found him a nice guy, Stacy erupted and demanded that she stay away from him. She rudely insulted her friend and slapped her. Stephanie responded in kind. Stacy grabbed her by the throat and started to choke her. It was at that moment that Stephanie allegedly grabbed a rifle and hit Stacy on the head 3 times. Since there was blood everywhere, Stephanie took a shower and changed her clothes. She placed a pillow on Stacy's head, cut a part of the screen on the window, and burned the cut piece and her shirt in the bathroom with a lighter. The girl revealed where the knife was, with which she cut the screen, and confirmed that she tried to erase the evidence from the rifle with a towel. She admitted that she was very scared and did all these things because she did not want to go to jail. Stephanie was arrested and charged with murder. However, just a few days after her arrest, Stephanie declared her innocence and claimed that her confession was extracted unlawfully, manipulating her and forcing her to confess using various persuasion techniques. The question was whether the jury would believe that Rhodes had done all this to Stephanie. The prosecutors were convinced that the confession was true because of the details that the accused revealed, as they were not known to the public. In particular, she talked about a knife that was found in a drawer. The investigators did not disclose where they found it, but Stephanie knew which drawer it was in. However, the police were not even sure that the screen was cut with that knife. Moreover, how could Stephanie not know where the knife used by all the girls was located? It is also important that the investigators themselves wrote her confession because the first version of the confession was not even written in her handwriting. At that time, Stephanie was still suffering from a female ailment and taking strong medication. Her examining physician confirmed that the girl was particularly vulnerable to police tactics, which led to a false confession. Her lawyers wanted to show the jury how easily she could be hypnotized. So they hired a psychologist who put her in a hypnotic state to go through the events of that night. Nevertheless, despite all the efforts of the attorneys, in January 1988, the jury decided that the girl had killed her neighbor in the heat of an argument, found her guilty of involuntary manslaughter, and sentenced her to 20 years in prison. Stephanie spent 9 years in prison and has long since been released but continues to assert her innocence. Today, Stephanie Alexander and her lawyers not only claim that all the evidence collected by the forensic experts points to a man, but they even name a possible killer, Charles Ray Crawford. He was charged with several other crimes, and is awaiting the death penalty for the abduction and murder of a student in Mississippi in 1993. There are indeed many similarities between these two cases. Crawford abducted the girl from her home. He managed to get inside by cutting the screen on the window. After abducting the student, he tied her to a tree, assaulted her, and killed her. At least 2 witnesses saw him in the college area on the night of Stacey Pannell's murder. He lived nearby and was well acquainted with the campus. Modern analysis of Stacey's underwear revealed the DNA of a man that could have been left when the perpetrator touched it, pulling it off the girl's body. A hair, identified as male, was also found on the bed linen, and on the rifle, which became the murder weapon, the investigators discovered a drop of blood that did not belong to Stacey. Now Stephanie's lawyers are fighting to have all this evidence re-examined and compared with Crawford's DNA. The main problem with this case in 1985 was the lack of evidence. There were no witnesses or physical evidence linking Stephanie to the case. Her fingerprints and hair samples were taken, but nothing indicated her involvement in the crime. That's why the police turned to Steve Rhodes, who gained fame as a polygraph expert. The detective supposedly could determine if a person was lying just by where their eyes were directed, which is considered completely unscientific even today. The detective did not allow Stephanie to speak, finish a sentence, and simply pressed her, stating that she was lying. The police claim that the few existing pieces of evidence confirm Stephanie's confession and that she committed the murder. Stephanie, in turn, although she has paid her debt to society, continues to insist that she is paying for someone else's crime.
Such a case has never occurred with investigators from South Dakota. There are 3 suspects, the husband, the lover, and the 12-year-old daughter, each with a motive for committing a heinous crime, but only one of them is guilty. Will the detectives be able to uncover the truth, navigating through the depths of anonymous letters, spy devices, and false evidence amidst the ocean of passions that unfolded around what seemed to be an ordinary American family? On the morning of Wednesday, February 8, 2006, Wyoming resident Bonnie Burns was sitting by the phone, eagerly awaiting a call from her daughter, 41-year-old Tammy Rhea, who lived in Pierre, South Dakota. Every morning for many years, Tammy would call Bonnie without fail. The sudden silence from her daughter frightened Bonnie, so she decided to call herself. Tammy's home phone went unanswered, and her mobile phone redirected the call to voicemail. She was also absent from her job in the shoe department at Kmart. Contemplating what to do next, Bonnie recalled the name of one of her daughter's colleagues, Brian. Tammy had recently mentioned to the family that she had been communicating with Brian frequently. Therefore, Bonnie dialed the store number again, this time inquiring if Brian was present. Brian Clark answered Bonnie's call in surprise. He also didn't know where Tammy was. However, in response to Bonnie's desire to contact the police, he asked her to provide him with the details. He dialed 911 and reported that he needed to report a missing person. Brian added that a crime may have occurred. When asked by the dispatcher why he believed so, he replied that he and Tammy were having an affair, and it was evident that her husband had found out about it. When 12-year-old Haley Rhea sat down to have breakfast, she immediately felt that something was off. Her father, Brad Rhea, was also seated at the table, but her mother was nowhere to be found. Tammy always busied herself in the kitchen, but now the house was unusually quiet. Haley walked into her mother's bedroom. All her belongings were still there. Her SUV was parked in the garage. The girl couldn't understand what was happening. Her mother couldn't have left without her purse, phone, or keys. They had spent the evening together, while her father, as usual, worked late, and her mother never once mentioned that she had plans in the morning. Perplexed about where she could be, Haley asked her father. In a hushed voice, Brad replied, "Sweetheart, she's probably with her boyfriend. She'll be back in 2 days." Tammy and Brad met in Billings, Montana. The young couple started dating right away, and within a year, Tammy was expecting a child. It was her dream to get married and become a mother. Tammy took care of Haley and the household while Brad focused on his career. In 2004, Brad's hard work paid off when he was offered a promotion to assistant manager at Walmart, but it required the family to relocate to Pierre. Although it was the administrative center of South Dakota, the town had less than 14,000 residents and lacked any significant entertainment options. One notable attraction in Pierre was the dam and the adjacent lake, a popular spot for fishing and hunting. However, it provided a picturesque and peaceful setting for the family, so Brad accepted the offer. The move from a big city wasn't easy for the family, but after some time, life in the new place began to settle. Haley found a few sports clubs to join, and Tammy found work at a store where she met Brian Clark. Unlike her husband, who loved his wife but couldn't devote enough attention due to work, Brian was always there for her. The news of her mother having a boyfriend came as a thunderbolt out of the blue for Haley. Although her parents had informed her 2 weeks earlier that they had decided to get divorced, this news caught her completely off guard. Her parents had explained to her that her father had been working incredibly long hours, sometimes up to 100 hours a week, and it had taken a toll on their marriage. However, they had promised to stay together until the end of the school year so that the changes wouldn't affect Haley's education. And now, with her father announcing that her mother had a boyfriend, Haley didn't know what to think. After dropping his daughter off at school, Brad headed to work. As soon as he entered, 2 police officers approached him. When Brad heard that his wife had gone missing, he was shocked. He explained that he hadn't seen Tammy since the previous day. When he arrived home from work after 10 p.m., his daughter was already asleep, and Tammy wasn't home. Around 1 a.m., Brad heard a car screech to a halt outside. He glanced out the window and saw Tammy park her black SUV, get into another car, and drive away with a man. Brad had recently discovered that his wife was seeing someone else and assumed it was his car. Succumbing to a sudden impulse, he got into Tammy's SUV and followed them, but soon his wife's car broke down, and Brad had to pull over on the side of the road. A passing patrol officer stopped to assist Brad. By the time the car started again, he had lost sight of his wife, so he returned home and went to sleep. The next morning, she was still missing, and he assumed she had gone somewhere with the other man. The detectives listened attentively to Brad's account of the events from the previous night. The store manager, a man of small stature and meek appearance, didn't seem like a threatening individual, and his behavior didn't indicate any signs of lying. The police asked if Tammy could have already returned home, and Brad willingly agreed to accompany them. It was a trick. The officers had already been inside the house and one of them noticed something through the garage window that caught his attention. When Brad allowed them to search his home, one officer went inside while the other headed straight to the garage. There, he noticed a reddish-brown stain on Tammy's car door. As he approached, he saw blood dripping from the vehicle's threshold. There was too much of it, and when the police officer opened the door, he was nearly overwhelmed by the powerful smell of bleach. Everything indicated a crime, but the officers didn't want to alarm Brad, who could demand the search to stop at any moment. The police decided to employ another trick. They asked Brad to drive with them to the station to answer some questions. And while the owner was not at home, they would request an official search warrant. Simultaneously, during the questioning of Brad, the police spoke with Haley. The girl shared that her parents never argued, and her father devoted every spare moment to the family. That's why the news of their divorce was such a surprise. Haley noticed that the impending divorce had also taken a toll on her father. He had been very moody in recent days, hardly eating anything, and he had called Tammy, pleading for her help in saving their marriage. Meanwhile, Haley's mother had behaved as usual. Tammy told her family that the house would stay with her and Haley, and Brad would move out. The family confirmed the girl's words. Tammy was looking forward to the divorce. She informed her relatives that the house would remain with her and Haley, and Brad would relocate. At the police station, Brad cooperated fully, answering all the questions. His wife had recently confessed to him that she had fallen in love with someone else and wanted a divorce, but Brad didn't know who the other person was. He adamantly denied any involvement in Tammy's disappearance and insisted that he had no idea where she might be. When the detectives informed him about the blood found on the car, he was shocked. While Brad was being questioned, the police obtained a search warrant for his home and thoroughly examined every room, but everything seemed completely normal, except for the blood in Tammy's car. It was a cozy home of an ordinary family. The amount of blood found in Tammy's SUV indicated that she had suffered serious harm and was likely killed. In such a case, Brad was the most likely suspect, given his wife's desire for a divorce, which provided a motive. They interrogated him for 5 hours until he insisted on having a lawyer. Although they weren't 100% certain that Tammy had been killed, they couldn't release the suspect either, as he could potentially destroy any evidence. The police had no choice but to arrest Brad on a first-degree murder charge. While Brad Rea was under arrest, the investigators invited Brian Clark to the police station. He arrived with his lawyer. Just like Tammy, Brian also had a family, a wife and a daughter. Brian told the detectives that he had last seen Tammy the day before her disappearance. They met at a motel, and then Brian dropped Tammy off at her home around 5 p.m. afterward. He went to a basketball game with his wife and daughter. He spent the entire evening and night at home. Brian mentioned that his wife could confirm his alibi, but she was unaware of his affair with Tammy, and he preferred it to stay that way. Once again, the detectives didn't know what to think. The man genuinely seemed concerned about Tammy, but the fact that he immediately appeared with a lawyer raised suspicions. Additionally, the fact that Brian's wife was unaware of her husband's infidelity provided him with a motive for murder. Perhaps, if Tammy had confessed to Brian, she demanded that her lover do the same, urging him to get a divorce or even threatening to talk to Brian's wife, pushing him over the edge. Access to Tammy's SUV was in the hands of her husband, but if his story about surveilling his wife was true, Brian could have killed Tammy and doused the car in blood to frame her husband. The police tracked down the patrol officer who had stopped to help Brad start his car, and he confirmed Brad's account word for word. Now, the police had confirmation of the story he had consistently repeated. So, who was the killer if the murder indeed took place? No matter how you look at it, without a body, the case couldn't progress any further. On February 9th, search teams began combing the extensive area around the city, where rarely anyone could be found except for hunters who frequented the hilly shores from October to January. If Tammy was here, it was unlikely that anyone would stumble upon her before the start of the next hunting season, 8 months later. By that time, wild animals would most likely have discovered her remains first. The teams covered kilometer after kilometer, but the woman was nowhere to be found. As the sun approached the horizon, the helicopter pilot decided to fly over the isolated plain, approximately 16 kilometers north of the city, one more time. While flying over the marshland near the dam, he spotted Tammy Rea's lifeless body. As it turned out, the woman had been stabbed at least 35 times. It felt as if the killer had unleashed immense fury upon her. It was an extremely brutal murder, but there was no blood around the body, indicating that the attack had taken place elsewhere. The officers found a t-shirt and 2 blood-stained gloves, but there was nothing that could provide clues to the identity of the killer. Neither the autopsy nor another search of the family's home yielded any results. The investigators had no choice but to interrogate Brian's wife. It presented an excellent opportunity for the betrayed woman to seek revenge, but she didn't take advantage of it. She confirmed that her husband was at home on the night of February 7th. However, despite the couple sleeping in the same bedroom, the woman suffered from back pain and often spent the night downstairs in a reclining chair. That was the case on the night of Tammy's murder. Therefore, Brian could have slipped out of the house in the middle of the night without his wife knowing. Once again, the investigation reached a dead end. Suddenly, the case took a completely unexpected turn. A letter was delivered to the office of the district attorney. It was written by one of Brian Clark's cousins. The man could no longer stay silent and wanted to unburden himself. According to the letter, Brian confessed that on Tuesday, February 7th, He met with Tammy at a motel and they agreed to meet again later. Brian arrived at Tammy's house late at night. They took 2 blankets and set off in Tammy's SUV out of town. After spreading the blankets, Tammy undressed, leaving only her t-shirt, and asked Brian to wear a condom, but he refused. Tammy's persistence infuriated him. He attacked her, and they struggled for some time before Brian forcefully got what he wanted. However, during the assault, the condom remained inside Tammy's body. In a fit of rage, Brian grabbed a knife and attacked Tammy. After killing her, he wrapped her body in the blankets and placed it in the SUV. He then returned home and parked the car in the garage. Brian had to share everything with his brother, who helped him get rid of the evidence. Many of the facts listed in the letter were not known to the public. The anonymous author could only have learned them from the killer. But there was one hitch. The initial autopsy did not reveal any condom. To uncover the truth, another autopsy was conducted. Incredibly, upon re-examining the body, the pathologist discovered this crucial piece of evidence that had somehow been missed the first time. The discovery promised to provide the much-awaited clue that the investigators were hoping for. However, due to the time the condom had spent inside Tammy's body, the DNA sample could not be used for comparison. What seemed like a promising piece of evidence raised even more questions. Whoever wrote the letter undoubtedly knew all the information about the murder, but there was still no physical evidence proving that Brian was the killer. Now the investigators understood what Brad was talking about during his initial interrogation. Even when it was unknown whether Tammy was killed, he had said, "All this evidence points to me, but I hope there will be a body because there will be something that will exonerate me. Maybe DNA. Something like that." Brad could only hope for such evidence if he himself planted it in an attempt to frame Brian. The question was, how did he obtain Brian's DNA? The investigators talked to Brian and learned that he often disposed of used condoms by throwing them out of the car window. It turned out that Brad had followed multiple lovers before. By tracking them, he discovered Brian's habit, which allowed him to devise a cunning plan to frame his rival. Of course, Brad couldn't have known that DNA would not be suitable for analysis if it remained in another person's body for a long time. The biggest problem remained that the investigators still didn't know where the murder took place. The police returned to the family's house for another search, hoping to find the slightest clue. In Brad's closet, an officer found something intriguing, a tiny digital recorder. When the detectives pressed the playback button, Tammy's voice filled the room. She asked to call Brian Clark. They spoke for a few minutes, and then Tammy said, "I love you very, very much." Since the beginning of the investigation, Brad had claimed that he didn't know who Tammy was seeing. But on the recording, Brian's name was clearly heard. Brad had set a trap to find out who his wife was meeting. He had placed the recorder in her car, along with a bouquet and a note. As Brad had hoped, Tammy assumed the flowers were from her lover and called Brian to thank him, inadvertently revealing his identity. Now the police wanted to know what else Brad might have been lying about and how he managed to send an anonymous letter while being in prison. Brad regularly communicated with his twin brother, Brett Rhea. When Brett was released from prison after a visit to his brother, the police were already following him. Upon his arrest, they discovered a very interesting notepad in his possession. It listed all the facts that later appeared in the anonymous letter. Additionally, they found a letter from Brad describing excellent fishing spots. He drew a map indicating several locations near the dam. Considering the murder charges against him, it was unlikely that he would be thinking about something as trivial as fishing. The marked locations were significant for another reason. Following the instructions, the officers found 3 large black garbage bags containing blood-soaked beddings. The bags also contained blood-stained rubber gloves, women's underwear, and a large tarp. The tarp explained why there was no trace of blood in the Rhea family's house. Here's how events likely unfolded on that night. Brad had prearranged the tarp on Tammy's mattress and placed several sheets over it to ensure she wouldn't notice anything. When she lay down on the bed on the night of February 7th, Brad entered the room and attacked her, stabbing her multiple times through the sheets and slashing her throat. The bedding immediately absorbed all the blood. Brad then carried Tammy's wrapped body, along with the sheets, to the garage, located right next to her bedroom. He placed her body in the car, planted the evidence, and loaded her body and the bags of bedding. As for Brad's story about breaking down on the road and interacting with the patrol officer, he was likely on the verge of getting caught. He was heading to Brian's house, intending to plant some evidence, confident that the condom would lead investigators to his rival. And when he realized that he wasn't discovered during the autopsy, he had to devise a plan involving the letter with a false confession and seek his brother's help to send it. The trial began in January 2007. Since the prosecutor did not seek the death penalty for Brad, in the event of a guilty verdict under South Dakota law, he would automatically receive a life sentence. The prosecutor expected the process to be brief and clear-cut, but Brad made the rare decision for a defendant to testify in his own defense. No one could have anticipated what he would say when he took the witness stand. Unable to hide the lie any longer, Brad felt that he had to confess everything. It was not him who killed Tammy, but his now 13-year-old daughter, Haley. Problems started after Haley was informed that her parents were getting divorced. She was furious because her parents didn't want to reconcile and spent whole days in a saddened state. On the night of February 7th, Brad returned late from work, and his wife and daughter were already asleep. He also went to bed but was awakened by the cat around midnight. Brad heard some noise coming from Tammy's room and went to check what was happening. To his horror, he saw Haley standing over her mother's body. She was covered in blood and holding a knife. There was blood coming from her nose, indicating that Tammy must have fought back. Brad shouted, asking Haley what she had done, but she stood motionless and didn't respond. Brad attempted to help his wife but realized it was futile. His daughter continued to stand there, showing no emotions. It was only then that Brad realized she was asleep. In panic, he took the girl back to her room and wiped off all the blood. He then tried to clean the crime scene. He put the clothes in the washing machine, and took his wife to the car. To protect his daughter, he decided to frame a man whom Tammy had seen. When Haley woke up the next day, she behaved completely normally, and Brad realized that she didn't remember anything that had happened. Initially, he wanted to escape to Mexico with his daughter, but he was arrested before he could do so. Brad explained that his daughter always had behavioral problems and had even stabbed her stuffed toys when she was a little child. He admitted that he had broken the law and deserved punishment, but only for trying to protect his child. The prosecutor was pleased that Brad provided testimony because attempting to accuse his daughter would have enraged the jury members. In reality, the evidence indicated that the wounds on Tammy's body could not have been inflicted by a 12-year-old girl, even considering that she was a fairly strong volleyball player. During the cross-examination, the defendant couldn't explain facts that had already been reliably established. Moreover, Brad's twin brother had already confessed to everything. It took the jury 3 hours to deliver a guilty verdict. Nevertheless, Brad Rea insists on his story. He unsuccessfully filed an appeal, claiming that he was framed by investigators, and that his daughter's DNA was never compared to the DNA at the crime scene. The most terrifying part is that if a condom with Brian Clark's DNA had been found during the initial autopsy, this case could have ended completely differently. The fact that the intended evidence was not found compelled Brad to bury himself deeper, acting out of desperation. Haley Rea lost both of her parents on the day her father decided to kill her mother. She moved to live with relatives in Wyoming and never saw Brad again. Fortunately, she didn't allow the incident to break her. The immense love that surrounded her mother became a source of motivation for the girl. Speaking out on public platforms, she became the voice of domestic violence victims who can no longer stand up for themselves. Haley pursued an education in criminal law, got married, became a mother, and only regrets that her son will never know what a wonderful, kind, and loving person his grandmother was.